Just yesterday that we did this, and now we're doing it again. It's a lot of that was driven by the fact that WXY was scheduled to be in town, and we needed to take advantage of that to get Claire Weiss in and give her a chance to address y'all. Very limited, availability for them, so I do appreciate everybody coming back again so soon. Today is going to be a very different discussion centered on urban development. We've got a couple of development companies represented here that are outstanding companies in our area, and then also ULI. And so this will be more of a panel discussion. I was asked to facilitate that. It would be greatly appreciated if we can keep this more dynamic and two-way, and if anything pops to mind from y'all, go ahead and just get it out there and make this a conversation. Otherwise, I'll muddle my way as long as I can. And when I start stumbling, Ward Davis has assured me that he will take over, which he is always happy to do. So anyway, without further ado, we've got three folks here today that I'm happy to have. John Coleman is the chairman of the board for the Urban Land Institute, Northwest Arkansas. I think everybody's familiar with ULI. But at least in my mind, the way I think of ULI is they're kind of the development side of CNU, the Congress for New Urbanism. They are very compatible. In fact, when I went to a CNU conference in Seattle, ULI was having a conference at the same time in Seattle. And the way that you could tell the difference was by looking at their shoes. If they were wearing expensive shoes, they were there for ULI, and if they were wearing sneakers, they were there for CNU. But it was a really good conference, and ULI has been great things. Recently, just stood up in Northwest Arkansas, and I'm sure John will have some things to say about that. Next is Jeremy Hudson with Specialized Real Estate. They've done a lot of, if you're familiar with the Uptown Apartments project in Fayetteville, and then Brick Avenue in Bentonville. Those are both typical of the types of projects that they do. We are often hoping that they'll do a project here in Rogers, so maybe you can encourage them to do that today. And then finally, Ward Davis is with High Street. High Street is the company that took the old Dollar Saver building and converted it into Onyx and everything that is so cool. They own some other property around that building and are looking to continue to do things in Rogers. They're also building Johnson Square. So basically, starting from the ground up, building a historic downtown in Johnson, Arkansas. And at least my sense of that is that Johnson must have come to a fork in the road not too long ago and decided whether they wanted to be a Fayetteville suburb or go ahead and just do their own thing. And so they decided to do their own thing, and they were very wise to somehow coax High Street into partnering with them. Ward is also, I don't know current, but the president of the American Town Builders Association. And last time I was before COVID, at a big conference, I guess it was in Louisville, Ward was speaking on mostly multifamily finance and how mixed-use developments are put together in finance and how you build a capital stack. And at that conference, which was well attended, that particular panel was in a very large room, and people were standing all along the walls and out the door to hear what Ward had to say. And so highly respected in the what I would say the more progressive areas of development. And so we're incredibly fortunate to have him here in Northwest Arkansas. So with that introduction, I'd like to just go one by one and have y'all open up and cover anything I missed and give your initial thoughts on where you see, I guess, help us to understand what's different a little bit between the things that you all do and the things that cause people so much angst over apartment complexes. So maybe start with you, Ward.
Oh, okay. So High Street focuses on urban and new urban neighborhoods. So we're basically urbanists. We believe very strongly in the kind of the value in a mix of uses in an environment, and pretty much dynamically go in opposition to Euclidean zoning, which is what we're all kind of used to, where you have, you know, this pod here and that pod there. And if you fly over most of northwest Arkansas, you can look down out of an airplane and say, okay, everybody that lives in this neighborhood, they make X number of dollars, and everybody that lives in this neighborhood lives in Y number of dollars. And then you got your multifamily folks that are unfortunate enough to live in multifamily living over here, and you got your retail strip centers along the roads. We believe that the most value is created in areas where all of that kind of coexists comfortably. And so we look back to times and places where, you know, just kind of best examples in the U.S., you know, favorite places where those things do coexist. So we look at like Charleston, or we look at the Garden District in New Orleans, or we look at Alexandria, Virginia, and we try to, you know, draw from that on how we can develop going forward. So on one end of the spectrum, we develop mixed-use neighborhoods like Johnson Square, and did a project called the Village at Hendricks in Conway, where we showed pretty effectively. The Village at Hendricks, for example, is about 70 homes, and people think of it as a single-family neighborhood, but it's got about 260,000 feet of commercial space, and it's got 170 apartment units. So it's much more, it's closer to an apartment complex than it is to a single-family neighborhood. So they can exist really well together. But we really prefer to work on projects in downtowns. It's just hard to do in northwest Arkansas. There are lots of obstacles to developing in downtowns. Lots of talk about developing in downtowns, and lots of obstacles to actually doing it.
Yeah, so just to kind of piggyback on that, I mean, you mentioned Alexandria, Virginia. One of the first jobs, I grew up in Northwest Arkansas, University of Arkansas graduate in the civil engineering program, and first job out of college was actually in Fairfax County, Virginia, just outside of D.C. And so the areas that we always wanted to hang out when we were there was Alexandria, Arlington, some of these communities that had kind of built out in these really intelligent ways, but also kind of some history behind them. And then lived in Austin. And so, you know, when I left DC, moved to Austin, I was really intentional about finding something that matched that. Like I wanted to live in a place like that. And then we boomeranged back to Northwest Arkansas. We now live in Washington Willow District, and it's close to downtown Fayetteville. But again, more of a historic kind of, you know, it has strong single-family residential, but has a lot of mix of uses around it and available. And so, you know, my office is within a mile, and you know, we have our own little cluster there. Kids go to school relatively close. My wife's job is relatively close, and so, you know, as I kind of got this granular education within my profession and became more aware of these. The way that these developments occurred, I think that's how I got more interested in ULI. We're a nonprofit organization, but we're, you know, in Northwest Arkansas in particular, we're trying to understand and help guide, you know, as we absorb this population. We're growing incredibly fast, people moving here every day. As we absorb this population, how do we maintain quality of life, improve quality of life, and do it in an intentional way and in a smarter way? And even lessons learned from, we've got a lot of cities around the country and a lot of examples, even those I just mentioned. You know, there are a lot of bad examples in the DC metro area, a lot of bad examples in Austin, Texas. You know, Austin has a really cool reputation. There's lots of really good things going on there. But you know, they've done some things really poorly, and they've done some things really well. And I think in Northwest Arkansas, we're kind of this, you know, third generation region that's growing in this way, and we can look back on other cities and other examples, things that have been done really well. And I think these guys have done that as private entities, kind of taking those lessons and putting them into place here. And so that's kind of what we're about in a nutshell at ULI as well.
Yeah, very similar stories to these guys, but I mean, for us, predominantly what we do is we develop what we call mixed-use multifamily communities. So apartments is the core of the square, you know, the biggest amount of square footage, but there's almost always some other component, whether that be office or retail or food and beverage or adaptive reuse. creative office or something like that. But it really just boils down to what we're doing is trying to create places that we would call our rent by choice communities. As Ward mentioned, I mean, for a long time, especially in certain parts of the country like Arkansas, apartments were thought of as a second-rate way to live. And for me, as a young man, I spent my whole career in Northwest Arkansas in real estate, first in brokerage and then in property management and then ultimately in development. So I was in my mid-20s. I wanted to live downtown, but couldn't afford a condo, couldn't afford a historic home, and I didn't want to live in a old rundown apartment complex. And those were basically the only choices in downtown Fayetteville, 12, 13 years ago. And so really our company kind of came out of the idea that, hey, let's develop a place that we would want to live. And by the time I got there, I already had kids and was married, so I didn't live in an apartment at the beginning. But essentially, we build places and spaces and projects where we think people actually would want to live, whether that be because they aren't interested in buying a home at that time, or because they're young and want to live in that type of neighborhood, or simplifying at any age. But there's a whole lot of people right now, obviously, particularly on the younger end and the older end of demographics that are choosing that lifestyle, and that's essentially what we do, is try to build places that people would want to live there, and that typically means that they're in a downtown neighborhood, that they're unique, which is very different than John. I think that a lot of the apartment development that has happened over the course of the last 40, 50 years, which is what gets a bad rap, is stuff that all looks the same, all feels the same, and isn't really designed for an experience or a lifestyle. It's just designed for a pro forma.
Jeremy, it seems like most of your developments are located on a trail, on one of the bike trails. And so kind of a two-part question. How important is cycling? It seems like we're having a moment right now for cycling in Northwest Arkansas. And then a follow-up, kind of related to that, back to this idea of location of multifamily. I think throughout the country, we have pushed apartments out to the fringes. What does that do, both to kind of the long-term viability of that development and society, to our society and everything else? Just this idea of location and the role of transportation and centrality to that when it comes to multifamily development.
Yeah, somewhat on purpose, but we started out developing on trails, and at the time it wasn't we have to be on a trail. It was more just so happened that there was a trail where we wanted to develop. And since then, like literally every single project we've done has been, within a stone's throw or right on the trail in Northwest Arkansas. And that part has been very much on purpose, and it's because, and for us, it's not that we necessarily, although certainly, I think as biking and particularly mountain biking gets more and more important in Northwest Arkansas, this may change, but it really hasn't been specifically thinking about cyclists or mountain biking or anything. It's just about an alternative way to get around. We learned that if we put people within a quarter mile, half a mile of something that they want to get to, and then particularly for us early on, it was the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, in downtown Fayetteville, that if we give people an alternative way to get around, then they're going to use it. Early on in our career, a lot of what we did was considered off-campus student housing, and we were literally just building, new apartment communities for students to live in that was off campus but easy to get to campus. And that, really did not exist or hadn't existed for decades anyway in Northwest Arkansas. And it was because, the town of Fayetteville hates students driving to campus, and students hate driving to campus and paying for it. And so it was really a simple idea of, well, if we can put apartments right next to campus where students don't have to drive, then everybody ought to like that. Not everybody liked the idea, that's for sure. But I think in hindsight, most people would say that's a good thing. And as a matter of fact, University of Arkansas has actually, campus planners have told us in recent years, like for the first time ever, like we're actually seeing, excess parking permits and all these things that we said we wanted as a campus or as a city actually have worked out. And so, and maybe that's an odd answer to your question, but I think it's a good study that if you put people close to where they can walk to work or walk to school or walk to, and I say walk, it could be walk, bike, trike or whatever, or to entertainment, then they're going to use it because it's convenient, it's more fun, it's healthier, and so that's our opinion is if we keep building projects like Brook Avenue, people will be able to leave they can leave their apartment right now and get to downtown Bentonville, get to all of the slew of recreational and cultural amenities and a whole lot of employment. And I think the same thing's certainly true about the future of downtown Rogers.
When you're fairly close to the midpoint between downtown Bentonville and the new Walmart campus, and so that's a pretty strategic near the momentary and 8th Street Market and everything else.
Yeah, it's not just about people being able to get to to a restaurant or to a bar. It's get to work or so I think that's really important, and I think that's one of the many challenges of building apartments predominantly on the outskirts of town is whether and I don't know that makes any difference whether it's an apartment or whether it's a single family home, except that if you build an apartment complex on 40 acres of greenfield and that's probably something like 150 or 200 residences and cars or families and maybe twice that many cars, then that's just that many more cars that are having to drive back to wherever the jobs are, and I don't think that's it's not very sustainable pattern of development in my opinion.
It's an extreme strain on municipal finances to put that many people that far out and increase the total number of vehicle miles traveled by individuals in the city. One of the most illuminating visits I've ever made, and we travel around a lot looking at different places for best practices, but we visited Fort Collins, Colorado, which has got one of the highest bike commuterships in the country. It's 7%, just 7%, puts them in the top handful. And I could not believe how little traffic there was at 8 a.m. in the morning and how easy it was to get around driving around because 7% of the workforce commuted to work. And then, so you start pulling on that thread a little bit and you realize we don't design all this travel network that we have around us. We don't design that for, even right now, we design it for the peak, and the peak is at 8 o'clock in the morning. It's not in the afternoon because school, in the morning you have school lined up with people going to work. And it's that peak that looks like this on a graph that we design the entire system for. If you knock this top part of that off with 7% commutership, it's staggering how much less infrastructure you have to have. And infrastructure is what, is what weighs on city finances. So if you look at I say the strong town stuff that's kind of floating around. If you listen to that sort of information, it's so easy with just a little bit of investment to see how that plays through. And furthermore, bike infrastructure addresses the folks that need it the most. The people can get around. It's very egalitarian. People can get around that can't otherwise. We think of it as being a life, that we all have to drive, and that's how we have to work. Well, my father just got diagnosed with brain cancer. He can't drive a vehicle ever again the rest of his life. So now he's either stuck in his house, but he could ride a bike if he lived somewhere that he had a bike node. My son has epilepsy. He's very bright, get around, can't drive a car, probably will never be able to drive a car. So he has to live somewhere where he has to get on a bike when he works, probably for the rest of his life. So not only does it take a lot of strain off the infrastructure, and not only does it a nice lifestyle to be able to get around places, it actually helps the people that are most vulnerable to be more productive in society. It also adds a lot of value to real estate. In fact, for single-family home lots, proximity to trails has just become the number one driver of home value after, for 50 years before, it had been mature trees were the number one value of single-family home lots, but now proximity to trails is nationally taking that spot.
That's one of the more interesting points, especially for this group. If you pay attention to professional sports at all, data analytics has taken over Major League Baseball, NBA, and the way that they strategize around what they're going to do on the court or whatever sport it is. Cities, we have this data now. Like I was talking about third generation region and learning from other cities, we are starting to much better understand the impact of investments that developers make, but then the long-term strain that either creates or doesn't create on municipalities as you're choosing, where money is coming from, how to spend that money. So, if you have groups that are developing on the outskirts of town and you're having to go in and widen to 4 lanes, like what is that doing? What is that long-term financial, what is the investment immediately, but then what does that do long-term for operations and maintenance on that infrastructure? I think we're getting a better grasp of that now. We have better access to that information. We need to deploy it better at the municipal level. But I think that's something that is coming, and we see that with some of the organizations that you guys are involved with as well, that have that available. And I think in Northwest Arkansas we could use that better. I don't know if you guys have good examples of cities that are already doing that. I've listened to occasional podcasts, and the different that different data that's popping up and how cities utilize it is really important.
We're upgrading our software suite to a package that will allow us to do a whole lot more GIS-based analytics. And at the conclusion of this seminar series, we plan to take population projections, set aside stream banks and whatnot, but basically build out the rest of the city with single-family housing and see how many of the future humans we can absorb by doing that, to help to understand the need for higher density residential areas. And then you get to the problem of where do those go. Mm-hmm. So Ward, at ULI, you were talking about finance and, kind of breaking developers into 2 camps. One camp is looking to build something, get the occupancy rate up to the point where it can be flipped and then sell it, and the impact that has on building decisions, versus another model that is a more long-term view. I think the cities are in the same perspective, or the same boat, where one of the things that we're looking at through Strong Towns is how can we manage our long-term cost of ownership of roads and other infrastructure. Could you just kind of share very briefly, the ULI talk and how those 2 different mindsets create 2 completely different products at the end of the day?
This is a rabbit hole I could go pretty darn
This
deep.
could be all day.
Yeah, this could be an entire topic. But the first thing, and this is something that Chuck Marone points out a lot, is that when a developer develops a subdivision and then hands over the infrastructure to the city, that's not a gift of infrastructure. That's a long-term obligation that the developer is handing over. So it's an illusion. It's a short-term illusion.
And that's why city councils accept that final plat. They're accepting a liability.
That's
is really what they're
exactly
doing.
right.
They're not accepting a tree plan or anything else. They're accepting the responsibility to care for the public infrastructure.
Yeah, but that's 40 years down the road, and right now you're getting revenue. So it's seductive. It's seductive as well. But the single family gobbles up a whole lot of land. Single family, the way we do it, gobbles up even more. The other thing that gobbles up a lot of land is parking requirements. We did a study on a project that we're doing in North Fayetteville, where if we took a conventional parking requirements and applied it to the entire neighborhood, basically it was 175 acres. Basically, we'd have 2 roads coming down the middle and meeting and going down the middle, and then with buildings on both sides of that one road, and then the rest of the site would be parking lot if we went with conventional parking standards. So both of those pieces, you can see the thought process where it seems like a good idea, but it's taken to its illogical conclusion because there are decisions that are made in a vacuum. And you've got with all these, the development is difficult to tease out the best way to handle it, but really it's subtle. That's what what we run into where we run into the most problems is where there are very rigid rules. You understand how each rule came into being, but they came from a silo. Whereas looking at one particular problem and one particular solution, and most of these solutions are subtle. So takes more thinking.
And context dependent. Like
Absolutely.
we've run into this with our standard cross section. We adopted a complete streets approach, which basically says creates a standard cross section of a street. Well, it depends so much on the function of the street at that location and what the surrounding area is that we're trying to figure out a way to articulate something that's more transect based. Mm-hmm. Very complicated thing. So
we that same 175 acres in Fayetteville, we are taking it from what they have called urban thoroughfare zoning, which is mixed use and very dense. It's their highest zoning category, really, as far as density and intensity goes. We're taking that awesome zoning and we're throwing it in the trash because the code around that zoning doesn't support actually building a dense mixed-use urban environment. So we're basically doing a PZD, and the only reason we're doing a PZD is because we have 125 master variances that we're seeking for the whole neighborhood, and of those, probably 60 of them are related to the standard street sections. So, if I could make one point at all today, or anytime I'm talking to anybody that has to do with any city in Northwest Arkansas, is that all these planning, all these long-range plans, all that sort of stuff that calls for mixed use, very dynamic neighborhoods, almost always the code is the impediment. It's not even the zoning anymore. It's the code itself. It's absolutely rigid and very antagonistic to those long-range goals.
I'll kind of throw this out to everybody. One of the things that we have in Rogers, developed like all the other cities everywhere. We would build an arterial road, and then there would be requests to commercialize that road, and over time that led to strip malls down the road. And then as that happens, the road doesn't work very well anymore, so we build another road and the same thing happens over and over again until you end up with gridlock. And so we have thrown that out and gone to this more polycentric approach where we're looking at nodes that would be transit friendly and have little pockets of neighborhood services here and there, but then three major regional centers, which are downtown, midtown, and uptown. Each of those areas, though, is covered in asphalt, at least, midtown and uptown. What are y'all's thoughts on redevelopment in those types of areas? Old malls, old strip malls, things like that. What does the future look for those, like for those, if you even have any thoughts on it? I know everybody's trying to figure this out, but how do you deal with these areas that are so auto-centric and absorb so many city resources to maintain?
I mean, I think it's obviously a huge opportunity. I mean, if you take a look at Google Maps and just that aerial view and start looking at the amount of pavement that exists in any one of our downtown areas, and then really the areas surrounding downtown and some of the suburban areas, there's a huge opportunity for redevelopment. And we're starting to see that a little bit in Fayetteville, Fiesta Square. There's some conversations and some investment that's going to be made there. It's a giant parking lot that is never full. I mean, you drive by there even on, Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving, or, during the Christmas shopping season, never full. And so the owner of that property and the city have been talking for a number of years now, and are starting to, redesign what that could look like. So I think, it's a massive opportunity. It also, you have to be a little more precise, I think. You've got this existing building infrastructure. There are a lot of times contractual agreements about advertising. So, you've got to be able to, someone signs a lease and you've got to be able to see their signage from the street. So it prevents infill. I mean, there's some of those conversations that are more nuanced, but it's certainly an area that needs to be focused on and a way to figure out redevelopment patterns there.
What's the best thing for those parking lots? More retail or what?
So the sucker's game is almost always more retail for anything, everybody wants everything to be mixed use, and by mixed use they mean retail, and by retail they mean food and beverage, and there's only so much that can go around. It really needs to be clustered. So we're the most mixed use guys that I know that are mixed use guys, and get nervous as hell about doing mixed use 3-story kind of conventional buildings. We only do them very occasionally. We only do them when they're very well situated.
And by that, you're talking about retail on the first floor,
Yeah,
office
that's
on
what
the
everybody
second
thinks
floor,
they want everywhere.
apartments on
That's
the
what
third
everybody
floor.
thinks they want everywhere. They don't want it everywhere. Trust me, they don't want it everywhere. Actually, horizontal mixed use is much more effective usually. There's a lot in there, so I'm going to try to hit 2 or 3 things in that little piece. One thing is there's an entire kind of thread within New Urbanism or Congress of New Urbanism that's focused on suburban retrofit or adaptive reuse of suburban stuff. There are two schools of thought. There's a school of thought that you can retrofit Fiesta Square and make it good, and then there's other thought that you should destroy it and try again. And I'm of the second. Generally, the best thing to do is just knock it down, and start over. But more fundamental, instead of trying to undo what we did poorly in the past, it had a very short lifespan. Think about how we can not do that again, and just planners drive kind of the new urbanism, which is kind of a bad thing because they always want the next great solution to whatever problem they've created. The last generation created like immediately prior.
Yeah.
But one thing that has just really stood the test of time very well, and it's very boring and very anti-planning, is just a rectangular block structure. I mean, if you had a mall and it was built in a downtown with a block structure, that fad didn't work out.
Right.
It's very easy to retrofit. You don't have to have these discussions about how do you retrofit it. It's easy to retrofit. We got away from that when the car made it easy to get away from that, but
We have a fairly new interconnectivity ordinance that requires through streets everywhere in order to try to impose a block without being like the Canadian model where they say you have to pick one of these 9 different block structures for every development. And it's been incredibly controversial, but this is why we did it.
Yeah.
To limit, first of all, gated communities and walls everywhere and to create better, more through streets, but also to limit the size of single-use stuff. You mentioned short life cycle of something like a mall or a strip mall. Can you kind of unpack that a little bit? What do you mean by short-term things that fail quickly?
There's just like you talked about earlier, you put this strip down, this road down, and then everything develops around it. It's nice and shiny for a little while, and then it's not the nice and shiny strip anymore. And if you pack too many cars on it, then it's not even supported for retail. I always use College in Fayetteville as an example. I'm sure it was nice and shiny in the 60s or something like that, and now it's not bright and shiny. It's hard to do stuff there. By virtue of unbelievable location in the middle of town, it will make it there eventually. But the ones that are secondary and tertiary strips like that aren't. They're not. Mm-hmm. They're just going to get bad. Yeah. But College also has so many car trips a day on it that now, I mean, if you want to turn left, it's like, what are you going to do? I mean, I try to avoid even driving down that road at all, and if I have to go somewhere, I'm like going out of my way to figure out how to make just right turns on that road. But the buildings were built. They're not built to last very long. You just look at how strip centers are built. You can tell they're not built for durability.
Or something you mentioned is maybe you can expand on it. Is we're talking about all this as new ideas, and really they're not all that new. They're really the oldest tried and true ideas that are being put back into practice. Yeah. From a planning standpoint, but also from a development standpoint. Can you elaborate on how the new ideas are actually not all that new?
The new ideas aren't all that new. We're getting new information about them, though. I mean, we're just taking the best places. Places. I have a architect buddy that defines it as places worthy of love, which is a little bit soft for me, but it's places that people care about. Those are the ones that do well over time, and that's one piece of it. But the other piece, and this is the one that's kind of really come to me over time, is that you can take places that function well, and they can go through a downturn and then come back, and they'll function well again. Downtown Memphis was really run down for a long time, but it's got conventional grid structure, and when it came back, it was cool again, just like instantaneously cool again. Downtown Chattanooga is the same way. It was when the industries there that were very heavy industries moved out. I went to high school there, and it was a lousy place to go to high school. Now it's like the coolest place in the Southeast. So, but if kind of the sprawly type stuff, when it falls out, it's in trouble. There's kind of a next ring that goes out beyond that. But the piece that I struggle with is, with like retrofitting old malls and that sort of thing, is where to put your effort. I mean, if they kind of limp along because they're helped to limp along, some things just need to fail. I mean, they'd be torn down and need to start from scratch. Like, one of the coolest areas with the most innovative, most interesting development in all the United States is Detroit. And it's because it just absolutely exploded, and there's no regulation, no ability to have, effective development regulations. And as a result, they actually have some of the best developments in the country and best examples. I mean, if I'm going to go check out the best new developments, it's going to be in my top 5 list of cities, much farther above Austin, which is like 95% crap, like 5% extravagantly cool.
So Houston is famously unregulated. Do you feel like it's been successful and that has made success?
It's been successful in some ways.
Some ways.
Houston's. It'll be interesting to see the arc of Houston.
Yeah.
There's so many miles and so many parking spaces per vehicle that I think it's going to be. And I don't know their municipal finances, but I think it's got to be pretty tough. It's some point in time. The problem is you don't know for 40 years.
I think though. Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Ford, Jeremy, John, either of you. So as we think about repurposing downtown, so like you gave the example of Memphis, of Chattanooga, part of that comes with that revitalization is gentrification. Mm-hmm. So in Rogers, we don't have it in its traditional sense, but we are moving out residents to breathe life back into this area. So attached to that would be affordable housing, in my opinion. So what's your perspective as the city of Rogers as we continue to grow and develop? How does that play into the revitalization of these spaces? So,
I think from the ULI perspective, it actually is one of the top things that we're focused on going forward. It's a problem that has not been solved very well anywhere, but we also have a really unique situation where you have a group like the Walton Family Foundation that is very dedicated to figuring this out, and so we're just on the cusp of entering into that space and starting to do some real work there. What's interesting too about where we are in Northwest Arkansas, I mean, ULI, obviously it's an international organization. There's a strong presence within the U.S., and they're all at the D.C. office. They're looking at us too. They're like, okay, this experiment that's about to be underway is something that they want to pay really close attention to, and then trying to figure out a model that can then be disseminated across other cities. So that's one of the things I'm excited about, and the reason I've kind of gotten re-engaged in the organization. But it's very difficult. Last week we had a tour of Crystal Flats, and it's an apartment complex, mixed use location there close to Crystal Bridges. 30% of the housing is dedicated to workforce housing, which is defined as 60 to, I believe, 110% of median income. They are 75% leased. The 30% that is dedicated to workforce housing is 100% leased, and they've got a waiting list. The difference there, it's developed by Blue Crane. They have Walton funding backing, and so what they call patient capital, they're willing to kind of dedicate that big percentage to that. That's not necessarily a sustainable model that can be translated across every entity, and so what we're trying to figure out is like, how do you what can be done to make things more affordable? Some of that is kind of what these guys have talked about already. Some of the policies, the limitations that are in place that add cost to projects unnecessarily is something that we'll be taking a look at, but it's going to be a variety of things. But it's really early on. I mean, there have been some good conversation. The U of A a couple of years ago hosted an affordable housing conference and brought in some different folks from around the country. But I think that it was ready to kind of be catapulted at that point. And then, of course, COVID hit and everything got slowed down. But I think we're about to see that conversation accelerate here in a big way.
So typically, and I want to keep this going, I'm not changing the topic at all. This is a great thread to go down. Typically, what happens is in affordable housing projects, it ends up being some kind of a private-public partnership where when the developer is doing their pro forma P&L, there's a gap in the capital stack that is filled some other way, either through public money or foundation money or something like that, which is incredibly difficult. I think in Arkansas, we have our own challenges because of Arkansas state law and our ability for public entities to participate in these things. Any thoughts on that, or anywhere else you want to go with
Well,
this?
I also think just when that model is limiting in that you don't get the units, you don't get the volume that you need. There are really good examples of projects and the way that it's being done, but it's like, how do you generate the sustained number of
It seems to
units?
be hard to replicate it in a larger footprint.
Mhm.
It seems like it works in mid-size where you've got 40 to 50 units, 60 units, but it seems very hard to replicate it bigger. The other issue that I've seen in Northwest Arkansas, and I assume this is everywhere, and probably one of the greatest reasons that we've not somehow solved this issue through the great thinking that occurs in our country, but I went to all the early meetings for the last several years about this subject, and you had 50% of the people in the room that were interested in low-income housing, that are the passionate advocates of the homeless or the disingenuous. And then the other half of the people are business people in the room trying to figure out how do we get our workforce under a roof where they can afford it. And there's two completely different subjects.
Right.
And then, the last meeting that I don't meet to meet, I can assure you, my life's too short, maybe shorter than I know, but I just told them, look, I love y'all, you're all great people, everybody's passionate here, but I'm not coming back to any of these meetings until we break this group apart and figure out who's going to solve what problem where. And I still think that exists today.
Yeah.
I'm just curious from what your experience has been, or do you see some of the same?
You see the same threads, coming up throughout. The places that have done the best with it, and nobody's done it perfectly, have successional housing where you have some old, some medium age, some new, and then it kind of rotates through. If you think about it, and the example that's used all the time is, let's say somebody needs their first car. Let's say my daughter's right out of school. She needs her first car to go to work. I'm not buying her a brand spanking new car. It doesn't matter what kind. I'm buying her a used car. So it doesn't make sense on the face of it to use brand new housing as your affordable housing. That being said, cars are mobile, housing is not, and workers are. So you end up in places where there's a lot of new demand, a lot of people coming from the outside. Those are the places that have the hardest time handling workforce housing, which puts Northwest Arkansas squarely in the crosshairs for how to do that. I think one of the easiest things to do is see where it's been done remarkably poorly. We can see examples anywhere there's a tent city, they hadn't done it right. So most of California, Seattle. The example that's thrown out all the time is Minneapolis, which surprisingly has tent cities for a city that's damn cold. So that's not how to get there. The other thing to point out, and this is on point, but a little bit of a tangent, is in the last 20 years, the spread between the cost of a new home, this is kind of getting into single family, but the cost between a new home and an existing home, that spread is wider. It's wider now than it's ever been. It's actually, that gap is slamming closed. But that happened over the last 20 years. So basically starting in the year 2000, that gap has been widening. And the reason is because it's been more and more expensive to supply new homes. And you can look at all the data points, And what you really see is kind of regulatory burden is a big piece of that. All of it well-intentioned, all of it does some good, but all of it added a bunch of costs. So over the last 20 years, you had a big increase in the cost of new homes. But we've just slammed into, and I think we're doing it right now before our eyes, we've slammed into where the ability of people to buy new homes is about run out relative to the cost. And whenever you hear about bidding wars and all this sort of stuff, it's for existing homes. It's not people built a new home and there are 18 bidders for that home. It is somebody came on the market with it. And that's more troubling, because that means that and the lower down in the price it is, the more likely they're to have bidders, and the more likely they're to be bid up. So we're running into a little bit of a problem. Well, that means we'll be supplying less homes. Jeremy and I were just talking about earlier. I mean, we're sitting on $1.7 million worth of plans right now we're not building right now because it's expensive to build, and I'm not sure when we're going to build all that stuff. We're building a few things, but we're not. We're being very selective about that. Well, that adds to the problem down the road. That doesn't take away. And then this is Andreas Dewani is a planner that gets a lot of attention. This is one that he brings up that I've just now started looking at. Is in the United States around 2000, most municipalities grandfathered in trailer parks. This is a little bit controversial because I think I'm always arguing for more durable construction, and trailers are the least durable. And I used to argue the other side of it. Well, basically about 2000, you can look at the number of mobile homes delivered in the United States, and they're about 15% of what they were. 15%. And then they've increased about 20%. And I used to gripe about them because they're not durable, until somebody pointed out to me that a mobile home does not compete with a house, a single-family home. Mobile home competes with a tent. That's the alternative to a mobile home. So we've actually kind of taken out that layer. You know, at one point that was about 20% of the homes in Arkansas. We've taken out that layer and pretty much made it impossible in cities, which is, of course, the people that have the lowest incomes, they're the ones that need to be closer to the jobs. So.
Yeah, I think one of the problems on the affordable housing side too is, a lot of when you talk about gentrification, it's happening in those areas where you have all of these other amenities. People are really attracted because there are multiple layers. It's close to jobs, close to downtown, and so a lot of times they're getting pushed further out. Maybe they find another home, but then their transportation costs increase because now they're no longer close to where they were working, not able to walk. They've got to own a car now, insurance, all the things that go along with that. That's the complexity of this. It's so layered. There's so many components of what is affordable, what's considered affordable, that we're starting to better understand, but don't have great solutions in volume to really address. And so that's what, and I mean, look, we're not the first, organization to look at it. We do have resources here that, a lot of other communities don't. And I think that's going to be really useful as we're kind of diving into what this could be. But again, we're really early on. And so, I'm a volunteer in the board chair role. I work for Integrity Partners, which is an energy company. And we're building our office, and it's in downtown Fayetteville. It's a mixed-use building. We're going to have office on the ground floor and then 28 residential units. But because we're also not a traditional developer, and we were really interested in the affordable housing conversation too. We were like, we're going to do 28 units. What can we do? And I felt like I was talking to right people within the region to figure out what that model looks like. And basically, at this point, it was like, you can make less revenue off of your project, which directly affected the loan that we could get from the bank. And so it's like, it's a legit, you can't just go in and say, well, we're going to do this out of the goodness of our hearts, because you've got to meet certain debt service coverage ratios and with the banks in order for them to make the loan. And so that, all of the nuance associated with it is really interesting. And to your point about the activists, we're doing it. It's a net zero energy building, which we're really proud of, and thought, man, Fayetteville is going to embrace this, right? We got crushed on social media because of the cost of the residential units, even though they're meeting market rates, but we're not providing any affordable housing, and we're displacing workforce housing. So yes, I mean, there are lots of layers to the
But
conversation.
what workforce housing are you displacing? What was in that site before?
Well, yeah,
Three
that's-
houses or
nothing.
something?
There
I
were
mean,
3
nothing.
houses that weren't occupied, but we're not providing solutions either in that realm. So there's a lot of.
It's a societal problem. It's
Yes.
not a your problem.
That's right. I didn't really take offense to it. I thought we were doing this really cool, which we are. It's a really good project. I'm not
Welcome to development, John.
right. my one time in that
John,
space.
along those lines, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Got a couple of questions. One, Mr. Davis, you mentioned early on about obstacles you were facing in building in downtown. What are some of those obstacles?
Man, you name it. Just downtowns just get a lot of scrutiny. So I will say, without a doubt, downtown Rogers is the best downtown in Northwest Arkansas to develop from the standpoint of this city. It's not, and it's not even close. We've either looked at or done something in all of them, and so Rogers is the best into that. That being said, when you start talking about doing anything downtown, all the little business owners nearby start talking about it. It just gets a lot of scrutiny.
We call them the committee of the concern.
That's the committee of the concern. That's right.
Can I interject real quick?
Yeah, go
Because
ahead.
you've said that repeatedly. Like, we would be at Maxine's having a beer and he would say that. And he's not just saying it because you guys are all sitting around.
No, yeah,
Downtown Rogers piece.
He said that in Louisville.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I've told other people that. Yeah, that's right. To continue that for 1/2 second before I go, code enforcement here even has an attitude, and I'm passing along what I'm not on the construction side, but what my partner says. The code folks here went through, when we were going through the 1907, they were coming up with ideas for how we could solve some things to turn that old building that was in rough shape around. The city was coming up with ideas to help us save money so that we could deploy in other places. And I mean, as opposed to being antagonistic, they were really thinking through solutions with us. It was incredibly refreshing. Okay. But back to things that like you guys might not think about that are burdens. For instance, and I don't know if these are examples in Rogers, but parking ratios, required parking ratios. We've been talking about apartment complexes way outside of town. Well, if an apartment complex is way outside of town, it needs a lot of parking spaces because everybody there is going to have to drive, and they're going to average driving 13 times a day, whereas somebody in the downtown, they're going to drive less often and they're going to drive less far. So the same parking ratios that make sense way outside of town are an added burden inside of town, especially where land is more expensive and more valuable. The other thing that comes up a lot, especially in like a town like Fayetteville that's always looking for a way to extract, is that the infrastructure is a little bit older. So the infrastructure is older. They're always hitting you with off-site improvements when you're coming in downtown, and really you're coming into an area that's already got infrastructure. So we actually get treated with a lighter touch on our Drake Farms project, which is it's got infrastructure around it, but the city is perfectly fine with running newer infrastructure to us and not trying. But if we try to do something downtown, they're trying to come up with a way to address the problem. Kind of the infrastructure issue. They got infrastructure that's 60 or 70 years old, so you get hit with more offsite in downtowns. You start running into fire issues on building heights and that sort of thing in downtowns. So you start getting it from a lot of different directions that again, all of these things came from a good place, but if you're outside of town and in a greenfield location, nobody cares. You can pretty much do what you want to, and developers are creatures of, as a group, developers are functions of stimuli. They're going outside of town because their nose got bloody going in town.
Yeah, I mean,
we all recognize we'd rather be closer than farther away.
Yeah, I think just to jump off that, I mean, developing in anywhere, but downtown is just more complicated. It just is. And so I think as a general rule, whatever you can do to make it less complicated and more straightforward is going to help a lot. And I think that what has happened in a whole lot of places, and I've said this to leadership in Fayetteville, I love developing in Fayetteville, and yes, it's hard. Sometimes that's an advantage because you don't have as much competition. But at the end of the day, I want to see Fayetteville, I want to see Rogers, I want to see Northwest Arkansas succeed. But what has happened in a lot of places is we've seen expansion, we've seen sprawl, whatever you want to call it, and we learn a lot of lessons as cities that we don't like. And so then we start coming up with codes and answers to stop that from happening. And then a lot of that stuff then further complicates an infill housing project, not on purpose, but that's just what happens. And so all these, and I don't know specifics in Rogers, but whether it be a street section or an impact fee or whatever it might be, those things that we learn, we're trying to stop bad things from happening, are actually preventing good things from happening. And that happens.
And rarely stop the bad stuff.
Exactly.
You get the lowest common denominator is always the easiest
and so
thing.
that's why you see, there's a slew of reasons, but that's one of the big reasons why is complication, a lack of just, and not a lack of transparency on purpose, but it's just because things are so complicated. A lot of people just aren't willing to put up with it. They're not willing to take the risk. They're not willing to invest the time. And the interesting thing, going back to previous questions about affordability, well, why is downtown Fayetteville, downtown Rogers, downtown Bentonville, pretty soon downtown Springdale, why are those places gentrifying? Well, it's because there are as a percentage, Bentonville may be doing the best job, but as a percentage, hardly any new housing is going in any of those downtowns. But yet, it's high quality of life. And so what happens is people are choosing to pay a bunch of money, frankly, a whole lot of people that probably didn't live here before. And they're coming in and they're buying or they're renting, and it's fine. They can afford it. And it's pushing other people out. So the thing that we can do, affordability is a huge, huge problem, huge question. It's a whole deal. And to your point, I think one of the biggest things we have to do is define what the heck do we mean, and it is different solutions. True low income housing, totally different solutions than affordable or workforce housing. The government defines affordable housing as just you're paying 30% or less. So affordable housing actually, by definition, has nothing to do with how much it costs. It's just how much does it cost relative to your income. And to John's point, it's kind of funny for me to hear him talk about this because we've been having to deal with this forever, and people get so upset when we build new apartments and they can't believe that we're building new apartments and renting them for $1,000 or $1,200 or $1,300, and it's when you think about it, let's say it, and we attempt to do what we would say as much naturally occurring affordable housing as possible. Project we're building right now in Fayetteville, vast majority of small footprint, a whole lot of studio or efficiency apartments. We're gonna have a big chunk of apartments that will lease for around $1,000 a piece. That sounds expensive to a lot of people that have roots in Northwest Arkansas. But $1,000 a piece means it's affordable to somebody who makes $40,000, a household that makes $40,000. So that's not that much money, which is one of the challenges that we see is a lot of people moving here for jobs, moving their families, or whatever. They're not coming with that perspective that $1,000 is expensive. They're coming with the perspective that $1,000 is crazy cheap. So defining what affordability means, but the thing is, in our downtowns, when you look at the number of multifamily or single family, housing permits that have been pulled and built within a reasonable proximity to our downtowns in Northwest Arkansas, it is a drop in the bucket.
Even when it looks like that there are high-profile projects getting built. Crystal Flats is like a drop in the bucket for downtown.
That's right. Our project in South Fayetteville, so just south of downtown Fayetteville, it's only 128 units, which is relatively, I would call that a medium-scale project. We had to convince the banks that it was okay, that there was going to be a market for it, because they look at, well, there's been thousands of units built in Fayetteville in the past 10 years. I was like, yeah, how many of them were for someone other than a student? And you could count on one hand or half of a hand how many projects were built for people that weren't students. And so the biggest thing I think in beginning to move, we have to figure out low-income housing. We need to figure out ways to do workforce housing better. And when you look across the country, I don't know of any examples that don't include multiple layers of, we'll just say cooperation, whether it's subsidy or not, but it's local, it's state, it's federal. Federal stuff is not going to ever solve it on its own. But the biggest thing we got to do is just build more housing. If we don't build more housing in our downtowns, then the demand's not going anywhere. It's just going to get worse, and so those prices are just going to keep going up.
We have a lot of like most cities, our primary tool in dealing with this is density, units per acre. And we have more density conversations than any other single conversation that I can think of about, multifamily apartments, all this. It's always about the number. How many units per day? What are your thoughts on density as a metric, and what do you think are reasonable maximum densities or even minimum densities? What do you think about density, Jeremy? And you probably do more multifamily than.
Yeah. I don't know why density is a bad word. I guess to some people it is. I think that comes with if you believe the density is a challenge, then you must be coming to the conversation with some negative connotations about the type of people that are going to be living, working, whatever we're talking about. Certainly, you have to be somewhat smart about parking. And again, are we talking about density and I know the answer is yes, density in a downtown environment or density somewhere else?
Or anywhere. Yeah.
But it is a different answer, because if you took away parking requirements for a suburban apartment complex, you're probably going to have a mess, because visitors and people are going to be parking in neighbors' yards or neighbors' streets, and people are going to be
Or developers will go in with parking in anyway.
yeah, they're going to be upset. But and I don't know downtown Rogers that well, but my guess is you could significantly underpark a apartment project or a mixed use with housing project in downtown Rogers, and the only place that you would really significantly see the difference is at night. There'd be more cars parked in parking lots and stuff that maybe are already existing. There is a yin and a yang to it. I'm generally a big believer in form-based code, but at the same time, when you completely remove not just density, but whatever use from zoning, what tends to happen, and this has happened some in Fayetteville and other parts of Northwest Arkansas that have adapted form-based code, is let's say somebody buys a piece of dirt in downtown Fayetteville and they put a hotel on it, and it was zoned whatever. It was zoned Main Street Center. So now everybody who has a piece of property that's zoned Main Street Center, they think that their property is worth whatever that sold for, even though there may only be a need for the next 5 or 10 years for one hotel in downtown Fayetteville. And so what happens, and this has happened in other downtowns, I don't know if it's happened much here in Rogers yet, but somebody somebody may buy a piece of dirt or not sell a piece of dirt because of their belief of the value that is based upon really an unrealistic understanding of the market, and then property just sits there and doesn't get developed.
One thing to say about form-based code, just as a tangent, I'm on the advisory committee for the Form-Based Codes Institute out of DC. Fayetteville was an early adopter of a form-based code, and is nationally used as an example of how not to do a form-based code. It is a nationally recognized bad form-based code.
Yeah. So, to try to get back to your question, I don't know.
And they know it.
Yeah, I don't know that maximum, I'm not even quite sure how to answer it, except to say, if you want more housing in downtown, what is it that you would want to try to prevent from too much density?
There's no housing downtown at all. What density are you worried about?
And so, the only thing I can even come up with, because more people is good.
You have an obligation
right?
to density downtown.
Yeah,
if it's going to function ever.
Exactly.
No housing.
I think other things, maybe height. Maybe we want to. We're worried about something that's too tall. Then I would say, then that's where you need to focus is height, or maybe, but I don't think this would honestly be applicable in downtown. Parking.
We've attempted to preserve legacy neighborhoods by setting single family densities to lower density where you don't want density, and then at our major intersections to have medium density, which to me means in the 20 to 30, and maybe at the high end, but in the 20 to 30 units per acre range for medium density, and then basically unlimited density in the downtown major regional centers.
I think that one of the facts that we're basically led on, we have to go up or whatever, or go north. But in the same sense, there's people who move out, build homes and have homes, and the first thing they come to us and say is, you know, you're gonna put this right in front of my front door, and I don't care if it's a mile away, I can still see it, you know, and that's.
NIMBYism.
Well,
Yeah.
one thing to recognize, and we all need to recognize, and everyone, I imagine most people in this room own houses, is that we are in a conflict of interest on homes. If you have a home and you view your home as an investment, you have every incentive in the world to wish no more homes were ever going to be built ever again, right? So nobody wants to admit that, but we need to just openly admit that single-family homeowners are absolutely have no interest, and nor should they, for their financial.
But are they experts in
circumstances.
the area of
No,
of
but
land use and
the
development?
more they knew about it, the more they knew that new houses would depress the value of their homes relative to what they could be, you know, the more they would like it less, you know. So understand
New
those
development
nice
is competing with their development.
homeowners
Yeah.
are being greedy too, you know.
There seems to be kind of a sense in Northwest Arkansas that the major cities are just leaving it up to the smaller cities to handle the affordable housing, the worker housing. You know, that we're perfectly okay with those other smaller towns becoming bedroom communities, while we kind of just own the retail and the revenue generating stuff. You think there's any truth to that? And what is the long-term effect? This is probably a ULI question. What's the long-term effect to our area if we allow that to happen? Because part of this is if we embrace some of these urbanist concepts and densities and things like that, multifamily housing, we haven't talked about missing middle, but if we embrace this, it reduces some of the pressure to convert farmland and forest land and stream banks and everything else outside of the big cities into just neighborhoods.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a really big opportunity here for the Prairie Groves and Pea Ridge and Gravitz of the world to be really intentional and intelligent about the way that they grow around. I mean, they have some existing history. You know, they've got these smaller downtowns and how to kind of use some of the population growth there to create communities at a smaller scale. People are looking for that, but not necessarily get excited about the bypass and the McDonald's that's coming to your community on the bypass, but building out your downtown again. They've got some of that existing infrastructure, and I think as a region, that's one of my hopes for the region is that those communities will kind of appreciate the opportunity that's in front of them, because it's a really good opportunity to bring back to life. I mean, Prairie Grove, if you spend any time there, they've got some really great antique shops downtown, some restaurants, some investment that's happened there, and so I think that's a real opportunity. I can certainly see why they would be saying that.
Not that it would ever happen, but do y'all believe in urban growth boundaries?
No, because they jump them.
You just jump them.
Yeah.
I do think land conservation there's a big opportunity here, and it is one of the things that I think Northwest Arkansas has done well. Obviously the Walton Family Foundation's been a big part of that, but land conservation efforts and even centered around growing mountain biking and outdoor recreation, that combination, because it does have a positive economic impact, but then at the same time you're also preserving land. I think there's real opportunity to continue to grow that model, even if it doesn't translate to an urban growth boundary. There's a strategy to be had there.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I believe that there are places that are appropriate to develop and places that aren't. But and one of the challenges, and we talk about this at ULI all the time, one of the challenges of Northwest Arkansas is, because we are a series of cities, which all have our own agendas and different priorities or different cultures and characteristics. It's very different than some places who could just say, whatever, whether it's Austin or whatever. Austin is the center. They are the city, and yeah, there's important suburbs and inner ring and outer ring, but Austin can make a lot of decisions, and I'm just picking them off the map, but that are going to affect long term for the region. It's much harder for us to do that because if one of our cities took a bold stance and started doing something like an urban growth boundary, it's going to be completely pointless without much more regional strategy about where is and where isn't appropriate, to develop for the region. And again, going to the small towns, I mean, there's a lot of opportunity to develop a whole lot of different types of neighborhoods. And there's a whole lot of talk about density and urbanism and millennials and all this stuff, but it's not like everybody wants to live that lifestyle, and that's fine. It's just that there's a much larger percentage now than there used to be, 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, of both millennials, Gen Z, but then also, boomers that are looking for a different, different way to live than they, more simplified or more walkable, more active, more access to nature, whatever it is. So, it's not a either or, it's a both and. But how do you develop small towns sustainably? How do you develop suburbs sustainably? How do you develop downtown sustainably?
The interesting stat that I always kind of focus on is that we're almost to 70% of households in the U.S. are one or two individuals. I mean, all this discussion almost always is centered around, especially when single family comes up as the heavyweight in the discussion. I'm an empty nester. I was married, had kids, or I'm still married, got kids, but my kids were home, whatever, 16 years or 17 years, and then they were gone. The rest of the time, the rest of my long life, hopefully, will be, less than that. But we think about housing in terms of, a reasonably finite period in most people's lives. So, so how you handle single-family homes. The other thing is, about 500,000 people in Northwest Arkansas right now. We got another 500,000 people coming by 2040. Number of structures in Northwest Arkansas is going to double between now and then. Well, how do we want that to look? Because, like you said, if you do it with predominantly single-family housing, or kind of the pattern that we have so far, you're going to look at it from the air, and it's going to be unrecognizable to us right now. So
it's going to look like LA.
That's right. What form does it look like? And if it does have that form, is that a superior lifestyle to having a more urban life? I actually like the urban lifestyle, so and a lot of people do. So I don't like it that way. And then the third piece, and we can always look around the corner to different areas and how they've handled it. Atlanta has gone with the single family and all the surrounding counties. You've got entire counties that are basically 2-story buildings, and already their municipal finances are falling apart. Already, just now, and there's nowhere to build anything else in the entire daggum counties.
Can you just unpack that a little bit? Chuck Marone talks about this an awful lot.
Yeah.
And can you just, because we're reading that book, but can you just kind of summarize what you're talking about?
Well, I mean,
the long-term costs.
Yeah. So it's fascinating. If you take most municipalities, even municipalities with like a downtown that seems tired and worn out and it's not doing very well, if you start looking at the tax revenue per linear foot of road, or whatever metric you want for infrastructure, and infrastructure being the one of the most significant burdens on for municipality long term, downtowns even look like they're not productive or much more productive. Asheville, North Carolina did a study about this and realized, oh my gosh, the downtown is the engine for everything else. And that's not widely understood. I listened to Doug Sprouse down in Springdale talking about, and they're putting an effort into their downtown. I listened to him tell somebody that the Sam's Club was required. You got to have the Sam's Club outside of town to finance the stuff in downtown. That's absolutely flip-flop from what's actually happening in that town. You got a Sam's Club that we know Walmart builds to last 15 to 17 years, and all the infrastructure required around that building and the very limited tax dollars per square foot of that entire area, it's an incredibly burdensome way to develop. So
I think that goes back to the data analytics comment I made earlier.
Yes.
I think we just, we almost need a Moneyball document for, for those of you familiar with baseball, but that's what we're looking at. It's like, what is that? What's the data that we need to be measuring? What do we need to be for every development that comes forward? We almost need analytics to go along with that to better understand what that long-term cost is going to be.
And how much we're subsidizing single-family homes. And
Right.
we need to throw that right in people's faces and say, all right, we'll just pay your fair share then.
Yeah,
You know?
I mean, I think for you as decision makers, as these developments are coming through the process, to be able to have a really good understanding of what that long-term impact, and even, obviously from a sustainable development standpoint, economically, things are going really well right now, and we know this. But we also know, if you look at generations of cities before us, there are going to be downturns. There are going to be things that will happen in the future. To set yourself up for long-term success, better understand what these infrastructure costs are and O&M costs. You've had your hand raised for a little bit. Yes.
I don't know if my question makes sense, but I know that, and you all talked about this before, that the trend is, okay, well, we have these wealthier people with reinvestment moving in, everybody else gets pushed out. But with that being much of the workforce that is working in downtown or in these like retail-oriented spaces,
Mm-hmm.
how are there any models anywhere in the U.S. that show the kind of like gradual improvements or connections to the city center that cities need to be aware of? I don't know if that's like building trails or like soft transitions to that account for the fact that at some point in the suburbs you may have more low income or people who are heavily burdened by debt that need an affordable place to live but still work in the city center. But for right now, you still have that middle class to upper middle class family living in that area, but you know that demographic is going to change
So
in the
prepared.
next 10 to 15 years. How do you prepare for that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a
tough
difficult
question.
question.
It's a deep
Yeah,
question.
I mean, it's a great question because you're really, as you talk about as a planner, kind of thinking ahead and what a neighborhood looks like right now and how it's going to transition and predicting that and being correct is really difficult. But there has been a major emphasis in the region placed on trails, not just mountain bike trails, but paved trails, the greenway, and then the connections. I do think Fayetteville's done a really nice job of making those connections across I-49, which has been a big barrier to the west for a long time. They put in a lot of investment. Even RDOT, as difficult as they can
As
be.
they drag their feet, but they're coming along.
But it's coming along, on some of those, the bridge renovation projects that are happening and incorporating some pedestrian bicycle infrastructure to make those connections. I mean, to me, that's the most obvious way. And obviously the communities, Rogers, Bentonville, Springdale are all making those investments now, which is great. That's one way to do it because, as I mentioned before, they go to where the housing is affordable, but then all of a sudden you're overlaying increased transportation costs and other things that is harder to predict. And also, home buyers or renters don't necessarily factor that in when they're making that decision, when they're signing that lease. They're not thinking ahead about, well, this is also going to add this much cost for gas or transportation on top of my monthly bill. So
We look at affordability as a function of the cost of housing plus the cost of transportation, that those are two pieces.
Mix of units is a big piece. Just allowing multifamily, allowing accessory dwelling units, allowing some of the missing middle. And it's not. And it's all incremental though. Like in the historic district in Fayetteville, now you can put accessory dwelling units by right with houses. And so that allows people to live in that, pretty exclusive neighborhood that wouldn't have access otherwise. Because a handful of multifamily units in the historic district are immediately bid up to very expensive because there's not enough of them.
And that doubles the density of that legacy neighborhood without actually building anything significant. That you and I can tell by driving down the street. So there are a lot of kind of incremental pieces that are not. There's not a one answer, but a lot of individual pieces.
Yeah, and I would just say, I mean, you have to find ways to increase the supply of houses in downtown, or you're not going to have a chance.
Yeah, and you're still going to be chasing your tail.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one thing. But the other thing, it sounds like what y'all are already doing is have more than one great neighborhood. And so
Yeah.
by doing this, node development where you already have neighborhoods that maybe just don't have the amenities that downtown have. So find ways to create other neighborhood centers that have, places to eat and places to shop and places to have a beer or whatever it is, places to work. Because, a lot of people, we think about transportation and, as getting to and from work. Certainly in Northwest Arkansas, it's going to be difficult. I mean, the way that our employment is set up in this region, there's a handful of people that employ so many people. We're not ever going to be able to build all the houses around those employment centers. But it's actually relative, especially now, post-COVID, it's going to be even less. The number of transportation trips that people actually go to work, that's not where they're using their car or their bike or their feet the most. And so if you develop those neighborhood centers, and maybe a resident still has to drive to get to work and back, but if they can walk to meet a neighbor, walk to a park, walk to a restaurant or whatever it is, or bike or whatever the alternative transportation is, then you're really increasing their quality of life, even if they're not still in downtown or whatever it is. So it's not a either or, it's a both and. We got to build better new neighborhoods, retrofit existing neighborhoods, and build housing downtown.
Yeah, I think your point about the 3 nodes, it's kind of perplexing to me that we haven't been doing this for a long time. It's like, it's great to have a downtown square, but nothing says you can't have 3 squares that operate in that same way in the same community.
Yeah.
And so the fact that y'all are moving in that direction, I think
There's
is really
smaller
smart.
neighborhood centers, just for a gallon of milk or grab a beer.
The most awkward way to do it is to have one developer try to do it. I mean, we're doing it
Yeah.
right now, but it's the most awkward way. It's not the optimal way to do it.
Yeah.
We've got like 3 minutes. Jeremy, there's one more thing that I wanted to bring up very briefly, and that is that y'all's model places a very large emphasis on health and, quality of your air and could you just talk about that real briefly, and then what is it that you're tapping into? This seems like something that, 10 years ago nobody would have paid any attention to, but it seems to be selling a lot of your product.
Yeah. So the brief history there is I grew up with pretty bad allergies and asthma. As a matter of fact, I'm coughing a little bit today. I, for some reason, have a little bit of, maybe the cooler weather's a little bit harder to breathe today. And so when I found out 11, 12 years ago, working with Matt Bell, one of John's partners, on our first project, I didn't have any idea. I studied construction and stuff in college, but I did not really understand that the way a building was built could affect somebody's health. And so when that was kind of taught to me, for lack of a better word, it was an aha moment for me. And from that point on, I decided, if I'm going to build buildings and build places, then I have a responsibility to build a place that's better for people to live in. And the idea was, if we can combine, and this was in Fayetteville, 12 years ago, if we can combine sustainability and the idea of living healthier, whatever that may be, whether you're talking about indoor air quality or access to nature, with great design in a great location, then people would like it, and it it's worked. And I people ask me all the time, whether it's coming from the health side or from the USGBC, from the sustainability side, like, well, how do you know how much people are paying because it's a LEED building, or how much are they paying because it's healthy? And I got no idea. I just know it works whenever you put it together. This is a whole long answer, and there's a lot of great ULI resources, by the way, around building healthy places. But the reality is the science behind the way that we've built buildings for a long time has been pretty bad. And to Ward's point, a lot of that is driven by the fact that most real estate investments are measured on a 3 to 5 year period, but we're building buildings that are hopefully 30 or 40 year buildings, and in a lot of cases much longer than that. And so we spend incrementally more, whether it be focused on energy efficiency or whether it be focused on health. One, because we think it's the right thing to do, but two, because we think we can at least recover that investment. And it's certainly a market differentiator now there's a whole lot more people in the last year that are thinking about the quality of the air that they're breathing in their apartment or their home, because they're spending a lot more time there. than what they did 2 years ago. But you know, that's kind of the real brief nutshell.
Yeah. You're not building a cruise ship.
Yeah. Yeah.
Really good filtration, and
Yeah.
and their products have a community garden, and they hire a gardener, so you can go and just pick your salad, you know, from the garden. It's really, really neat.
I will say, we'll take this off of him and put it on me, is that I get a whole lot more magnanimous when we figure out a way to make either break even or make a little money on something that's
Yeah.
helps the world. So we do mixed use developments because we think that it adds to the value of the surrounding real estate where we really
You are a
harvest.
capitalist.
That's
Absolutely.
right.
And-
Well, I mean, you know, we talk about the triple bottom line. It's hard as hell to make the single bottom line work.
Yeah.
You know?
Can you tell us
It's all
the-
broke as hell.
What
trying
are the
to
three
make a single
elements to
bottom
that? I
line.
don't know if everybody knows that term, but what are the three elements to the triple bottom line?
Oh, I don't know. It's making a profit first of all. and
Ethan
then
Hunter.
being really goody two shoes.
Economic,
Yeah.
environmental, and
Social.
Equitable. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
Well, I know in development when I've worked with not-for-profits, which we're working with one right now, it's been an eye-opener watching them struggle with the single bottom line.
Yeah, right.
They got all sorts of ideas for the other two bottom lines.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, we are out of time. Thank you very much. I hope everybody enjoyed this discussion. You know, our interaction with the development community is usually at a rezone or a large-scale development, and you just hear the tip of the iceberg. You know, you only hear the discussion about the variances and the waivers. You don't get a whole lot about the thinking and the economics that go into development. We hear a lot of that because we're with the project a lot longer than most of the people in this room are. And so I thought it would be very valuable for you to get a little bit of insight into what some of our top developers are doing here and what ULI stands for. So thanks for coming out. Appreciate it.
Thanks, John.